Welcome to NetBox Heroes. This is a podcast inspired by NetBox and the network automation communities where we're featuring and we're learning from inspiring networking pros in our community. I'm Chris Beavers. I'm the CEO of NetBox Labs. I'm your host today. There's a really exciting ecosystem forming around NetBox and other open source network automation projects. And our goal with NetBox Heroes, this podcast, is to learn about the people in our community and how they've developed in their careers as networking professionals, what their networks are like, some of the problems they're tackling, how NetBox and other tech fits into the stack. I am very excited to have, actually for the second time today, Ian Chilton on the podcast today. For those tuning in, we did a killer recording earlier today, and the podcast software didn't work. So here we are again, but practiced. So we're going to have an even better recording the second time, I think. Ian, has a bit of a different history than some of our other guests. Ian came up as a software developer, operations engineer, and right now Ian's a DevOps engineer at LONAP, which is a major internet exchange that's based in London, through which quite a lot of traffic is flowing all day, every day. And I'm really excited, Ian, to have you back again for the second time today
Thank
for
you.
another great conversation. Thanks for
I'll
being on the
try
show.
again.
Cheers. Okay, well, why don't we dive right in? Maybe we start with the obvious. Why don't you just tell us a little about yourself and your background and how you found yourself evolving over the course of your career on the way to LANAP?
Yeah, like you said in the introduction there, I feel like my route into network engineering is probably different than certainly than a traditional network engineer. I came from a software development and operations background. Often my peers that I see who are more traditional network engineers, that's what they've done their whole career, and then they maybe get into writing some code because of the need for operation, where I came from the other direction. In fact, kind of funnily enough, I work with networks and switches every day, but in some ways I struggle to call myself a network engineer because I don't have that background. So I've tinkered with and set up networks at home, churches, small business, that kind of thing, since I was a kid. Um, but was as a career was very much a software developer. So after graduating with a computer science degree in 2002, I spent a year as a software engineer at British Telecom, and then spent 10 years working for web development agencies. I didn't do any design front end kind of work, but I did all of the back end work on websites in the early days of e-commerce. And as those were small companies, I was also involved in other things, like responsible for setting up and managing servers to host those websites, and the networks and internet in the offices that we operated from. By doing that, as well as tinkering with servers outside of work and other interests, I really got into Linux sysadmin, operations, production environments, fixing things when, of course, they break in the middle of the night, and other soft skills like learning to stay calm under pressure, work out how, what's wrong and how to fix things when, when customers are seeing errors, or, everyone else is panicking. It was me that relied on to fix those things. So you kind of pick up that kind of skill. In 2013, I fancied a change from that customer projects, web development kind of side of things, where there's always more projects than you've got time to do. So much work to do. So I worked for a startup for a year, doing development, and then when that failed to raise another round of funding, I got a job with a hosting company, which was almost a bit of a dream for me at the time. I'd known and had contact with these guys for a number of years and used their products. They had their own data center, which is all kinds of interesting things. And their company was around selling virtual machines and dedicated servers to customers. And so that was really interesting. That was my first remote working job, and I've been remote ever since then in 2014. And again, although I was employed as a software engineer, I got involved in lots of operations and sysadmin with data center work, which I found really interesting. And in particular, I took on a lot of responsibility around their cloud hosting virtual machine platform. And I actually ended up moving to manage a team like an operations team to manage that platform as well as the rest of the company's internal tools and customer facing, portal and all that kind of thing. So yeah, that company was sold in 2018, and I continued working there for a while. But under the new owners, it didn't have the same technology and engineering focus, which is one of the reasons I really like working there. So I applied for another job as a DevOps engineer at LONAP, which, spoiler alert, I got. And I've been there ever since the beginning of 2019, so over 4 years now.
Wow.
So that's up to date.
We earlier talked a little bit about my own background, and I think one of the things that we find often in our community is there's no one path into networking at all, and I think this really illustrates it, right? You grew up as a software developer, an operations engineer, and hosting, and these other categories. It's my background is pretty similar to that too. But in a lot of ways, all roads lead to the network, especially when you're working on fundamental infrastructure and you find yourself really passionate about the systems that connect us all and make kind of the modern network work. Now, on that note, it it is a bit of a different background. And even today at LUNAP, you have a role that isn't a pure network engineering only role, right? You have a DevOps role. So that's a term that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Maybe you can talk for a few minutes about what is DevOps, what is this role that you have at LUNAP, and what's your day-to-day like a little bit.
Yeah, you said about the network there. It's just a little anecdote. It's interesting because my wife and kids always joke that they don't understand what I do, um, and or friends will ask what I do, and my wife and kids are like, we don't really know. You could be a spy or anything. So it's quite nice now to kind of say, the internet, like that's what I do. Like,
That thing.
yeah, so they understand a bit more about what I do nowadays. But yeah, DevOps, I feel like it's almost a bit of a modern buzzword, but it really accurately describes what I do and what my role is. I do software engineering, software development, write code, but then I'm also heavily involved in the operational side, implementing monitoring, dealing with alerts, debugging problems, dealing with any outages.
Mm,
Thankfully, they're rare. Applying configuration changes, automation, maintenances, software upgrades, setting up and managing servers with other services that we use to manage the network. Um, even data center work, moving switches around, links, fiber, optical networking, and just dealing with all that hardware that both runs and supports
mm,
the running of the exchange. Getting back into my original point, I work with this network and networking and switching and fiber switch configuration day in, day out. I've even set up several routers for a few different ASNs in the default free zone. But yet, for some reason, I don't feel comfortable calling myself a network engineer. So I'm not sure at what point that seems right. I guess I'm just comparing myself to peers who have done that their whole career, as I mentioned earlier. So
Yeah, but yeah, and we touched on it a few minutes ago, but I think there's no one path into network engineering, and you're definitely a network engineer in the sense that you're making the internet work for a large chunk of the UK all day, every day, I think,
yeah.
and, working very directly on the network, right? Uh, it's great. So, one of the things that I think folks have really loved to hear from other guests we've had on the podcast is a little bit about, some of what they've learned along the way. Like we have certainly folks coming up through, call it traditional network engineering backgrounds, but a lot of folks in our community, just like you or I, have grown up in other areas too, software development or system administration and the like. So you've had this interesting path. You've certainly learned some things. What are some of the lessons you would share with other folks who are, now getting started in networking or getting started in their path?
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is you find something you're interested in, find something you're passionate about, and almost get yourself into a position where you can do that. Get yourself in at the deep end. I've behind me, just off camera, I've got a bookshelf full of books, but I don't have time to read books. I've read very few of them, to be honest. Where I've learned to do that, I've never really had training in this stuff. Where I've learned to do it is on the job. Is when I've needed to do it, I've had to work it out, make it up as you go along, kind of thing. So yeah, so that would be my advice. Find what you enjoy. If you enjoy doing it, you're gonna learn it. You're gonna make it happen. So yeah, kind of do that.
I think that's great, and we hear this theme. We hear this theme over and over, actually, in the conversations we have. Um, when you hear how somebody who's senior in their field, really got there, it's first of all, they found a thing that they're really passionate about and enjoy. And second, they just get started doing it, right? Whether it's in a lab environment or, because they have to solve a real acute problem at work or any of those things. That's how you learn fast. You don't learn by reading, you learn by doing, right?
Yeah,
So,
and none of us
really,
know none of us know it all either. We make it up day by day. We go and look things up when we need to look them up. There's things we used to know and can't remember, and we go and look it up. You don't have to know it all to do this kind of thing. You almost, I find, you just have to be technically minded, and you work it out as you go along.
I totally agree. Totally agree. Well, great. So maybe we pivot now a little bit to LONAP itself and the technology of LONAP. So first of all, what is LONAP, and maybe tell us a little bit about this network that you're operating day in and day out.
Yeah, sure, yeah. LONAP is one of the major internet exchange points in the UK. We're based in London. We're a not-for-profit neutral internet exchange. We were established in 1997, so we've been going quite a while. We have around 250 members who are all equal stakeholders. Some you'll have never heard of. Others are household names like Google, BBC, Microsoft, Netflix, Sky, Vodafone, eBay, Twitter, as well as big content delivery networks, hosting providers, and internet service providers. In case anyone in the audience doesn't know what an internet exchange point is, so the internet isn't a thing. For the internet to work, every network has to be able to talk to every other network, and you either talk to them through a transit provider or you peer with them, so you connect with them directly. Now, obviously, if you're doing a lot of traffic between two networks, then they might actually directly connect. But router ports are expensive, cross connects are expensive in data centers. You can't physically connect to everyone. So what you do is you connect to an internet exchange where lots of people all connect to an internet exchange, and then they can exchange traffic.
Hmm.
Just to tell you a bit more about the setup at LONAP, we have we have 8 points of presence or racks in 7 of the major London data centers. We have over 20 switches in production. They're in a leaf spine topology running VXLAN. We light dark fiber between data centers in either multiples of 100 gig or nowadays with 400 gig. We've peaked at just over 1 terabit per second of traffic, or about 130 million packets per second. So quite a lot of traffic flowing. We have members connected at a gig, or lots at 10 gig, 40 gig, or nowadays many of the bigger networks connect to us at 100 gig, or even have multiple 100 gig parts, potentially in different locations. And then, as well as the switches, we obviously have all of the other infrastructure to support that network. So we run an out-of-band management network, terminal servers or console servers, optical multiplexers. We run a number of VM hosts, servers running VMs. Obviously, we have routers and firewalls for our own network. And then we do all of that with 4 full-time staff, a part-time bookkeeper, and non-exec board of elected directors. So we do quite a lot with a small number of people.
I mean, let's just reiterate that for everybody. So that's, at peak anyway, about a terabit of traffic flowing through this exchange. That's some critical infrastructure, and that's, real network scale there. And that's being done, again, with 4 full-time staff. So that's really incredible, and managing obviously across 8 points of presence and all this other infrastructure. So I have to imagine there are some interesting challenges, at that scale with such a lean team. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, what are some of the hard parts here, or some of the big challenges.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, for me, the two big challenges that come to mind are, firstly, the internet is never offline, or you don't want it to be
Mhm.
offline. It's a 24/7, 365-day-a-year business. We aim for zero downtime. Obviously, occasionally something might go wrong, and that hopefully is out of our control, and we have to deal with that. But um, you know, it's on all of the time, so you can't just change something by unplugging it. Like we have to develop, and we have to innovate, ways of changing things without anybody noticing. Um, Obviously, sometimes we do need to unplug things, and we have to have a maintenance window that's announced well in advance, and a quiet part of the day, either late at night or early morning, usually. Um, we have an innovative way of taking the traffic away from ports, so we don't cause disruption while we do maintenance. And that's something called BGP session culling, where we apply an ACL to every member port that passes all traffic except BGP sessions. So that causes the BGP session to go down, and then the traffic will route, through networks, through other networks, instead of through us. So then we can kind of unplug things and move them around. Um, that was developed by one of my colleagues and
Mm.
some peers quite a while back. But yeah, generally, we have to engineer around these things to try and make it as little disruption as possible, or make lots of changes without anybody noticing. So basically, we get paid to not break the internet. And then the other challenge is, being a non-for-profit. Obviously, we operate in an industry where things are expensive. It's very expensive equipment to run these things. Very expensive services like fiber and data centers and power and all that kind of thing. So being a non-for-profit, we aim to operate all this as cost effectively as possible. And we aim to, while most things price is going up at the moment, we aim to drop our price every year, as
Mm.
things become more cost effective. Um, and there's a juggling act there of having plenty of capacity, um, and being able to cope with, spikes and that kind of thing, um, without spending more money than you need to, if you like,
Yeah.
make it as cost effective as possible. So there's some challenges there.
So basically, what I hear there is no downtime ever, but don't spend too much either. All right,
Yeah, exactly.
pretty much, right? And no pressure. And so I think very naturally from that flows this theme of automation. Like you've got four people in your team who are managing this critical infrastructure day in and day out. They're presumably needing to achieve quite a bit. And I'm sure automation is a piece of the puzzle, but how has automation been part of, call it the solution to some of those challenges for LONAP, and how do you think about network automation generally in your stack today?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, we do it on a small team. We have four people. One of those is an MD, and then there's three of us that are more technical. But with those people, we've got to cover the whole company. So
Mm.
there's customer support. Um, there's running the actual network. Um, there's all of the sales kind of side. Promotion, marketing, that kind of thing. So as a small company, you do get involved in different things. Kind of I'm mainly here to do the DevOps stuff and the operations stuff, but I'll also do some customer support if the guy that normally does it is away,
Hmm.
that kind of thing. But yeah, obviously to do that, we need to kind of automate as much as possible and make things as easy as possible and as quick as possible to do. Up until 2020, the network was configured manually. We did have a small script to set up inter-site or inter-switch links, because there's a few different things involved in that, like setting up BGP sessions and stuff. But other than that, switches were provisioned manually by copying and pasting from a
Mm.
template that we'd prepared. Member ports were then configured, one by one by hand. Um, and and that's how it very successfully worked for many years. But one of the things I was brought in to do was to automate that, which, like I say, I kind of did. I was tasked with taking a production network that's doing all that traffic all of the
Mm-hmm.
time, and have to take that configuration, template it all, build this automation, and apply that to all of the the live boxes without disrupting any traffic. Thankfully, we managed that okay.
No
Um,
pressure.
yeah, exactly. Nowadays we still log into switches to look at things, check things, but any configuration changes, other than if it's specific testing or whatever, then any configuration changes are made by running the automation, and that actually applies it to the switches. Obviously, that then makes it much more consistent, because you don't kind of have this bit of config here, this bit of config here, and over time you change the way you do it,
Mm-hmm.
or bits get missed or whatever. Um, but it also takes away the human element. The templates are rendered, the config comes out. At the point we apply it, we get a diff just to say, just check this is the change you're intending to make. Yes, make it. But then obviously it takes away, particularly if it's like the middle of the night or something, it takes away that human element of, I've just gone onto the wrong switch, or I've
Yeah.
pasted it to the wrong interface or something like that. Like,
Well, what I hear there, and I think this is a really important point to reiterate, is automation isn't purely about productivity or efficiency all the time, or at least there are other indirect drivers of that, and
yeah.
consistency, reliability, and eliminating opportunities for kind of normal human
Mm,
mistakes, right, is a big driver behind automating the network, especially when you're tasked with something as critical as
mm,
passing a terabit a second at peak of traffic through your
mm.
network
Yeah.
for the internet, right? Got it. Uh, well, why don't we talk a little about the stack, right? So you're doing some automation in this network, especially driving most configuration change with automation. What does that actually look like? What
Mm.
what are some of the tools of the trade?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're recording this now, because, like I say, back in 2020, I set all this up using SaltStack, and we use SaltStack for managing servers, and all the VMs that we have, and that's really useful because we do all kinds of different things. So we create files and install packages and run commands, and kind of screw all these servers around into the right
Hmm.
state. And SaltStack just worked brilliantly for that. We've also done Ansible. Um, but on the networking side, what I ended up implementing was a lot of the logic in templates, in Ginger 2 templates. So that's worked great for several years. But SaltStack's a big stack, and it's a big piece of open source software that's maintained by other people. And what I kind of came to realize after we'd implemented all this stuff and used it for a few years, I got
Hmm.
to know what we wanted. And actually, all we're using SaltStack for is to pull in data from some systems to render those templates and to go and make the configuration changes to the switches. So, actually, hot off the press in the past week or so, I've started writing my own tool to do that. That will be custom for what we're doing here and what we need and how we need it to work, or how we would like it to work. And that obviously means it's much more under our control. We're not worried about salt breaking, and then we know we have to either dive into the code ourselves, or
Hmm.
in a massive software project, or raise issues which we're then waiting on other people to fix. If it's our code with minimal requirements, then um, we it's just better for us. So yeah,
Yeah.
just in the past couple of weeks, I'm just looking at that.
Well, that's fascinating. So what I think I hear there is, you began, at least on the networking side, using Salt to introduce this automation that made a ton of sense because it's this mature product and ecosystem, and you could draft on it. And then, over a few years, you sort of learned
Mm,
from that, right? And now, maybe with the benefit of those learnings, you're taking the next iteration, call it, with something that sounds like it's going to be a little simpler,
mm,
and a little more tailor-made based on what you found in
exactly. Yeah.
that kind of first iteration. Hmm, Interesting. I think there's a kind of a generalized lesson there for our community, which is uh, it- like you didn't implement a bunch of automation and then be done, right?
Mm. Yeah,
You learn, your networks evolve, your needs around the automation have evolved, and you're iterating on the network automation strategies as a
yep.
result of those things toward the outcomes you have, which are resiliency and
Mhm.
and efficiency and so on. Got
And
it.
in the future, I'm sure it'll change again. As things need to expand or change, so it's almost a constant.
And I
Yeah,
think I just think that's such a great lesson for network engineers listening to this, right? It's the network is almost a living beast, and your automation goals and the set of tools and the problems or challenges you're solving around it, you're never done, right?
correct. Yeah.
Got it. Well, one tool you haven't touched on yet, but I have to imagine is providing some of the data that's driving some of these templates that you're rendering, and some of the strategy around automation is obviously NetBox. So, I'm really curious to hear a little about what led you to discover NetBox, what led LONAP to start to use NetBox. How does that fit in? How'd you encounter it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, back in like I say, in 2014, I worked for a hosting company, and we wrote a lot of our own bespoke software there. And one of the things that implemented was a rack organizer, which stored everything about all the racks in the data center and the contents of them, and all the different servers and that kind of thing. And then I saw NetBox come along, and it was like, oh, this is an off the shelf tool that pretty much does all that without all that development that had been put in. When I started at LONAP, they were already using NetBox, so so yeah, that was already in place. But yeah, and then as an aside, I was involved last year in EMF camp, electromagnetic field, which is like a hacker, maker, geek camp in the UK, bi-yearly event, where it's lots of people in the field, and then we have fiber to the field. We put a massive network into that field. So I was involved in that last year. We provisioned something like 55 switches, which we distributed around the field. I set up a router, a transit peering router in London. The fiber connected back to London, and then all of these people turned up for this camp and got power, got Ethernet, got Wi-Fi, and that was all again driven from NetBox. So even for just a short term, 1 week event like that, something like NetBox is really useful.
I love the sense of, call it like agility that evokes, but it's also just fun to imagine building a network like that literally in a field,
Yeah, and then throwing it
for
away at
such
the
a
end of the
short term
week.
use. Yeah, and then throwing it away. Totally ephemeral. That's cool. Well, so one question I have here is, back at LunApp, we've learned a little bit about the network, the kind of traffic that's flowing over the POPs and the infrastructure and so on. Uh, what what is the part in the network that NetBox actually plays today? What are you using it for?
Yeah, of course, yeah. We have a lot of plans for NetBox and stuff we haven't had time to implement yet. But we currently use it for very heavily for inventory management, as well as using it for VLAN and IP address management. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 8 full racks of equipment. We need to know, all the time what is in those racks, where are those devices. We might be getting new hardware, and we need to know where can we fit it into that rack. What do we need to move around? So NetBox really helpfully lets us manage that, and lets us visualize it with the rack views and everything.
Hmm.
Um, as the purpose of our business is interconnection, we have a lot of optics. So I just checked NetBox earlier this morning. We have almost 800 devices in there. Some of that is hardware that we're not using anymore. It's been retired, or it's elsewhere, or even disposed of. But nearly 800 devices. Just over half of them are optics, and we don't actually have in there all of our optics. We didn't go back and put 1 gig and 10 gig ones in that are kind of old stock now. We've only kind of put in the high value 40 gig, 100 gig, 400 gig optics. And like I say, we have around 400 of them in there, so it's quite a lot of tracking. Um,
Mm,
so it's
got it.
useful.
So on the inventory side, everything is in there, aside from the old stuff that doesn't really matter anymore, I guess. And like talk a little bit about in and around NetBox, right? What are some of the other pieces of tech in there in the stack that are, either interacting with NetBox via APIs or that NetBox is interacting with? How does it fit in? What are some of those workflows like? I'm curious to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, so for the IXP side of things, we use an open source tool called IXP Manager, which was written by our friends at Inix, who run one of the internet exchanges in Ireland. That's a bit like our customer database, so it stores
Mm,
details of all of our members, their contact details, what ports they have. We can see graphs of each port. That feeds our billing. It handles generation of the config for the graphing of member ports in the exchange. It also builds the config for our root servers that all members, or a lot of members peer with.
mm,
But then so that's one source of truth. NetBox is kind of our other source of truth, if you like, other than some configuration files. NetBox manages all of the hardware side of things, as I say, racks, devices, optics, as well as things like shelves and patch panels and even
mm,
cable lacing bars or whatever. They will all show in the rack so we can see what is actually space. PDUs, terminal servers, all of those kind of things are all in NetBox. As well as, like I say, VLANs, IP addresses. And when we create new virtual machines, we'll allocate an IP in NetBox, so we know that one's then used, because
mm.
you can't, without a spreadsheet or something, and without NetBox, you would be you would be lost.
In trouble. Yeah, a
Yeah,
little
exactly.
lost. Uh, got it. Well, maybe you can talk a little about some of the, like, I know you've built some interesting scripts in and around
Mm.
NetBox, and just some of the automation that's driven right off of NetBox itself. I think would be interesting to hear a little bit about.
Yeah, we have quite a lot of just scripts which talk to NetBox via the API, pull inventory data from NetBox. So, for instance, that feeds into our monitoring. It feeds into our and the software that we use to do device backups from switches, etc. And then we also use the API to put data into NetBox. So rather than sit on the data center floor, we get a new delivery of optics. Rather than sit on the data center floor and start entering them into NetBox, what we do is we put them all into switches, and then we have a script that queries those switches, looks at what optics are in which parts, and it then enters them into NetBox. With serial numbers, model numbers,
Mm-hmm.
manufacturers, etc. So we kind of populate NetBox from the network, and then we also use NetBox as a sort of truth to configure the network. So it's like a big circle of data.
Hmm. Well, you know what you described there, and this catches my attention because I think it's representative of the most common modern network automation architectures that we see is you've built scripts to kind of query, especially new optics as you bring them into the network, and load them into NetBox. You're doing discovery basically, and then you've built other tools to drive more active elements of your network, like monitoring, for example, or configuration generation from NetBox itself. And you described it exactly. It's sort of like this circle of the source of truth, discovery and observability, the operational state of the network to bring NetBox in line with what's happening in the real network itself, and then kind of active automation of other elements of the network as a result of that. And that's a really common network automation called reference architecture that we see. And I think the other takeaway I have from that, these are scripts, right? Like network automation needn't be some huge holy grail. I've climbed Mount Everest and now I can go home and AI is going to run my network type situation. That's not really what network automation is. It's about picking off these repetitive tasks that are otherwise either laborious, like
Mm.
sitting on the data center floor and typing in all the details of all the optics you've just racked,
Yeah,
or
we've just bought 50 optics. Like, you
exactly,
don't
like
want to
what
sit
a
and put them in.
waste of time. And guess what's going to happen if you're doing that, right? There's going to be one typo somewhere in there, and it's going to
Yeah.
be brittle, right? So that you're solving those problems, and that's really, in my mind, what automation is mostly for.
And it's ever changing. We need to do a job, so we go and grab some optics from one site. They go in our backpack, and then we turn up at a completely different site and put them in a switch, or even just move them within a switch. So
Hmm.
that stuff isn't constant; it's constantly changing. So we'll have people in the data center doing data center work, and then we run the script, and NetBox is up to date. These optics are here, they're in use, they're spare, this is the details about them, and whatever job we do, when we need optics, we just search NetBox and oh, there they are.
No, I really appreciate that, kind of outcome. Um, Well, we're nearing, I think, the end of our journey here, Ian. I think one thing I know our community generally appreciates hearing about is what is it about NetBox that you really, love, you really couldn't live without? What is it that makes it a valuable tool in your stack on a day-to-day basis? Beyond, all this stuff that we've talked about, what is it that you find you really couldn't live without?
Well, like I say, so many things. The user interface is great. Um, or having a user interface to that data is great. The API is really useful, as we just talked about, putting stuff in, getting stuff out. Um, just also the reliability of it. Just a little anecdote. A few years ago, we noticed there was a fork made of NetBox, and at that time, we didn't have time to look into that or what it was about or what was happening there. So we just almost froze our NetBox installation at the fork point, so we could make the decision later on which way to go. And then we kind of realized that a year or even 2 years had passed, and looked at the releases of NetBox, and there was pages and pages and pages of them, and it was like, oh crikey, we've got a long, major versions had passed. It's like, oh, we've got a long way. It was doing what we needed to do, but we got a long way behind here.
Catch up.
So
Yeah.
I looked at the upgrade guide, and it suggested, do an upgrade via an intermediate version. I upgraded to that intermediate version. Um, I upgraded then to the very latest version. It was really quick. It all worked perfectly. All of those scripts that talked to NetBox, not one of them broke. We didn't notice any problem whatsoever. And I'd say we had skipped a lot of and
Mm.
several major versions and a lot of releases. In testament to the developers and the backwards compatibility and the API specifications that they must have. Um, it was really quick and it worked absolutely beautifully. So credit to the developers and the community involved in that.
I think first of all, I'm sure that the maintainers and all the contributors in the community really appreciate hearing stories like that because I know that they work their butts off to make sure that um, this tool is easy to use even in scenarios like that where you're upgrading across a bunch of different releases. And I think that's in no small part because they themselves are network, engineers and operators, and they understand the critical role that this thing plays, and they understand what people using the software are trying to accomplish and care about, right? So that's a great story. I think this is probably a pretty good spot for us to wrap up. Anything else, Ian, that's on your mind or you'd like to get off your chest before we wind down our time together?
No, I think just to say thank you to the developers, to the community, to you guys. Um, all that work is really paying off, and it's a very, very useful tool. Like I say, whether you're running an internet exchange or a smaller network, or you're setting up a network in a field, NetBox is a great tool, and if that wasn't around, it would be a lot of development to make something equivalent. So the fact that you guys and everyone is developing this thing just to be used as open source is absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much for all your work.
Well, yeah, and of course I'll relay that, and we'll all relay that to the rest of the community. But I also think we are really grateful for you and your time and the time of everybody who's using NetBox and contributing and sharing their stories and sharing their feedback and so on. That's what makes a great open source community. I think we're really lucky to have that here with the NetBox community and the network
Definitely.
automation community at large, right? Well, with that, I think it's time for us to wrap up. So, Ian, thank you so much for joining and sharing with us today. This is really fascinating. I think we learned a ton from you today, a very different story and path than we hear from some others who've come up in networking. And for everyone who's tuned in, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ian.